What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Here we are with another reaction, and in this one we have why the UK economy is doing surprisingly well. I wouldn't have guessed that. You know, it seems like since I watched videos about like Brexit and I thought the economy was down and the cost of living was going up, and I thought, and then with the drama in the UK and everything going on, I thought the economy would be not on a just terrible downfall, but declining a bit. But I guess I'm wrong, and they're about to tell me why. If you guys happen to enjoy this video, please, if you would like to support this channel, you can become a member by hitting that join button to receive exclusive benefits that I know you guys would enjoy. Let's dive right in.
This video is brought to you by Imprint. For at least the past decade, the UK economy has been in a bit of a state. A post-2008 slump in productivity growth was compounded by Brexit, then the pandemic, and then Liz Truss. And the UK's median household income has been basically stagnant since. In the inflation surge of the last few years, the UK has also fared remarkably poorly. It struggled with some of the highest inflation in the developed world, while simultaneously suffering with some of the lowest growth rates. However, in the past couple of months, the UK economy has suddenly started outperforming expectations.
Really?
Growth has been surprisingly strong, inflation has fallen, and from a certain angle, the UK looks better placed than its European peers to cope with the escalating geopolitical turmoil.
What?
So in this video, we're going to look at why the UK economy has suddenly started doing surprisingly well.
I gotta know
whether this tiny mini boom can last. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a quick recap of the UK's economic performance over the past few years. Because, well, it's pretty rubbish. Like basically every other country, the UK was badly affected by the uptick in energy and food inflation that we saw in 2022 and 2023. Inflation was already on the rise in 2021 thanks to a spike in consumer demand post-pandemic, reaching 5.5% in the UK in January 2022.
5.5%? Jesus! What kind of inflation do we have here in the US right now? I need to figure that out.
But it accelerated to new heights in the months after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Year-on-year inflation rose to a high of 11.1% in October 2022, hovering above 10% until April, and then falling to 4% in January 2024.
Nice.
For context, this was higher than both the US, where inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022, and the Eurozone, where inflation peaked at 10.6% in October 2022.
Dang.
Comparisons to the UK's European peers are even more embarrassing. In Germany, for instance, inflation peaked to 8.8% in October 2022. In France, it peaked at 6.3% in February 2023. And in Spain, it peaked at 10.8% in July 2022.
Spain was close.
But by June 2023, it had fallen to 1.9%, below the ECB's target and well below the 8% yearly rate the UK was suffering with at the same time.
Nice.
Now, you might expect high inflation to at least mean high growth, because high inflation is often a symptom of strong domestic demand, which would mean high consumption and therefore at least a relatively high GDP.
I didn't know that was what high inflation meant. Honestly, when I thought of like high inflation, I thought it meant like less growth, if I'm being honest. Just because it seems like, no, it would mean strong growth. Because if it was growing less, then things would become cheaper, right? But if everything was going strong and there was a high demand for things, then yeah, things would become more expensive. I'm such an idiot. Okay, let's continue.
Unfortunately for the UK, that's not how things panned out. Despite the fact that the UK's GDP was already doing worse than most of the G7, with UK GDP per capita down about 1% in real terms since the pandemic, the UK continued to post weak growth throughout 2022 and 2023. After posting relatively strong growth in the first quarter of 2022, GDP basically stagnated for 7 consecutive quarters, from then until the end of 2023. At the end of 2023, the UK actually dipped into recession, defined as 2
Dang.
consecutive quarters of negative growth, with GDP shrinking by 0.1% in the third quarter and 0.3% in the fourth quarter. However, in the past few months, things have suddenly started to look at least a little better. In the first quarter of 2024, the UK economy grew by 0.7% quarter on quarter, representing an annualized rate of nearly 3% and the highest in the G7. In the second quarter, the UK economy again fared pretty well, growing by 0.6%, the second fastest in the G7 behind just the US. This was largely because the UK grew by an astonishing 0.4% in May alone, double what analysts were expecting. Now, it's important not to overstate all of this. In many ways, the UK is still just catching up with other developed economies, which have generally fared better post-pandemic. And the UK is still the second worst performer in the G7 when compared on this metric. Nonetheless, good economic headlines are rare in the UK, and most commentators and most of the UK public basically thought the UK economy was doomed. This is why the forecasts for the UK's economic performance in 2024 have improved markedly.
Just from the videos I was watching with them talking about Brexit, and you hearing so many people like on the street, like so many citizens in the UK were like talking about it was a bad choice, they were lied to, things are more expensive, cost of living is higher. I would have just thought, UK's economy is not doing good right now. But to see that it's improving and at a decent pace, like, shout out to the UK.
With the analyst consensus rising from 0.4% at the start of this year to 0.9% in July. So what's going on here? Well, you dig into the data and it looks like most of this has been driven by growth in the UK services industry, which has grown by about 2% in the past 6 months. This speaks to a wider cause for optimism about the UK's economy. It's often forgotten by the media and politicians, but the UK actually has a pretty great services industry. The UK is the second largest exporter of services in the world, after only the US, accounting for about 7% of the global trend, and exports grew by a further 7% in 2023 alone. For context, when we talk about services, we're talking about things like insurance, banking, or education, all things that British companies provide to the rest of the world. The UK does less well when it comes to exporting physical goods like cars or petrol, which were all badly affected by Brexit. But the services industry has held up remarkably well, and the UK economy is increasingly service-oriented. The UK's focus on services bodes well for a couple of reasons. First, global demand for services, and especially the services that the UK specialises in, like law and accounting, has risen faster than demand for goods since at least 2008. This is largely thanks to the fact that, as economies develop and professionalise, they start wanting more services and less goods, and this trend is expected to continue in the coming years. Second, services are far better insulated from escalating geopolitical competition than goods. This is because economies like the US, China and the EU are now all fighting for manufacturing market share in an attempt to guarantee themselves a degree of industrial independence. This means that economies that rely more on manufacturing and exporting goods, like say Germany, where much of the economy revolves around exporting goods like cars and machinery, are now entering an increasingly competitive global market, dominated by subsidised industry in both America and China. Luckily for the UK though, services trade will be less affected by geopolitical frictions, and could even be helped, if increasing geopolitical friction requires more litigation and insurance. Now, the slight downside to the UK's persistently strong services sector is that it's kept service inflation, which the Bank of England is particularly worried about, relatively high, coming in at 5.7% in June. But while this might make interest rate cuts slightly less likely in the long term, overall inflation isn't at intolerable levels, and the fact that wage growth is slowing suggests that the UK isn't at risk of the so-called wage price spiral that keeps central bankers up at night. Ultimately, this is all great news for Starmer, both because he gets to take credit for something he didn't really have any control over, and because strong growth is basically the only way he'll be able to afford any investment in public services without raising any of the taxes he's previously ruled out. If you want to keep...
So I feel like, the UK has risen, so the service industry is why their economy is starting to kind of see growth. And it's amazing to know that they're doing so well in the service industry when that's an industry that is that is going to be less affected by geopolitical things that are happening. Whereas the goods industry is just, it seems like, is very competitive and continuously getting more competitive. And so being great in the services industry and there being such a strong demand for services works out perfectly for the UK's economy. And UK, seems like the UK is trending more towards continuing to show growth in the service industry.
Learning the best way is through Imprint.
Oh.
That's the brand new way.
I'm gonna skip the sponsor. I think that means it's the end of the video. Yes. So please, in the comment section, let me hear what you guys think about this. Do you think the UK's economy will continue to rise, that the service industry will continue to grow, or do you think this is just a mini bump that may fall right back down? If you're living in the UK, do you feel the economy changing? Is there a difference in cost of living? There a difference in the price of things as the economy grows? Or I would love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed that video, please don't forget to subscribe. Give the video a thumbs up. Also, check out that next one. I'll see you guys next time.